History at USC and an acclaimed author of a wonderful book, Hitler in Los Angeles. And Steve is going to be our moderator and introduce our speakers. So hi, Steve, and hi to our speakers. Welcome. Wonderful book, and Los Angeles. And take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name's Steve Ross, and I'm the Myron and Marian Casden Director of the USC Casden Institute. And I'm also a professor at USC. And on behalf of Wilshire Boulevard Temple and the Casden Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's Casden conversation featuring Stephen Windmueller and Dr. Saba Soomekh, who'll discuss anti-Semitism in the age of coronavirus. But before I introduce our speakers, just a very quick word about the Casden Institute. If you've not attended any of our events, we have 3 endowed lectures during the year. In addition, we have the Casden Conversation series that aims to bring together students, faculty, and community members for more informal discussions that explore a wide range of contemporary issues that are at the forefront of American Jewish identity. And our goal from the beginning and today is to bring light, not heat, on topics of interest and relevance. And if you're not on our mailing list, just go to just Google Casden Institute and you'll get taken to our website and you can sign up. I also want to mention that our next event, which is also being held in partnership with Wilshire Boulevard Temple, will be on Sunday, October 18th at the same time. And Stephen Windmueller will be in conversation with Dan Schnurr, talking about the 2020 elections, Jewish trends. A brief note on today's format. Normally our conversations go 90 minutes, but given the now familiar Zoom fatigue, we're trying to keep it to roughly 1 hour. And our format is our speakers will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll probably have 20 minutes or so for Q&A. If you look on your Zoom, you'll see there's a place where you can actually, it says Q&A. At any point, if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A. And in order to get to as many questions as possible, try to make it short rather than an essay. And after our speakers, I will I will go through the questions, pose it to our 2 panelists, and they will answer. So now to introduce them, Stephen Windmueller is the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Emeritus Professor of Jewish Communal Studies at Hebrew Union College. And prior to coming to HUC, Dr. Windmueller served on the staff of the American Jewish Committee and the Jewish Community Relations Committee of the Los Angeles Jewish Federation. And while at HUC, Stephen served for 10 years as the director of its School of Jewish Nonprofit Management, and then as the school's dean. And between 2012, 2014, he was invited to teach classes at both at USC and Nanjing University in China. Professor Windmueller is the author of 4 books and numerous articles. His research focuses on Jewish communal trends, anti-Semitism, and Jewish political behavior. And during the pandemic, Dr. Windmueller has been devoting his research to examining the impact of the coronavirus on the American Jewish Committee. I'm also pleased to announce that Stephen will be editing a volume for the Casden Institute on Donald Trump's impact on American Jews, and that will be released in 2021. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you.
And joining him is going to be Dr. Saba Soomekh, who is the Associate Director of the American Jewish Committee of Los Angeles and a lecturer at the Academy for Jewish Religion, California, where she teaches Jewish studies and Middle East history. And Dr. Soomekh has written extensively on world religions, women and religion, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. And in the summer of 2019, she was a scholar in residence at Oxford University's Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. Saba is the author of From the Shahs to Los Angeles, 3 generations of Iranian Jewish women between religion and culture. And she has edited our Casden annual volume on Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in America. Welcome, Saba. And now, without further ado, I turn everything over to our.
Well, thank you for the invitation to join my dear friend Saba, and to thank Wilshire Boulevard Temple and the Casden Institute for hosting us. Anti-Semitism is clearly a topic of concern to Americans in general and to the Jewish community in particular at this moment, and one that deserves critical attention. We will begin this afternoon with a brief introduction via the use of a PowerPoint, and I would invite Don to now post the PowerPoint so that we can begin this conversation to sort of frame the contemporary issues that I think we are facing. Moving on to the next slide, please. I would say that we are living at a moment where all the various forms of hate, and more specifically anti-Semitism, are very much relevant. Certainly the traditional tropes of anti-Judaism and more contemporary themes of racial equations against Jews, conspiracy theory, as well as the notion of whiteness and what it may mean to be white in America. All of these, amongst others, are very much dominant as a result of the hate we see during this period. Interesting, as we know from history, the confluence of events, economic, political, and in this case, a pandemic, create the kind of triggers by which we see the rise of anti-Semitic expression and behavior. And pandemics throughout history have created the notion of plagues associated with the idea of conspiratorial behaviors. The Jews poisoned the wells, as an example, or the notion of some type of Jewish conspiracy to control the outcomes of a plague or a health crisis. We have also seen huge amount of mobility of people as people are forced to move, as the health crisis and these moments of economic upheaval create a significant amount of physical movement, which is disruptive and creates further tension and change. The next slide, please. What we are observing on our very websites and on these kinds of Zoom arrangements is what has been known as the war against the Jews through Zoom bombing. The messaging that is being delivered not only on those sites but elsewhere are really the core principles of the blood libel, the notion of power and greed, the notion of Israeli conspiracy. All of these themes have been raised, whether by the government of Iran or by individual groups from the extreme right or the far left. And we have seen, in a sense, a kind of redefining of contemporary anti-Semitism as a social platform phenomenon. The next slide, please. In many ways, what we have identified in this period of hate expression has been targeting Israel and employing, as we have suggested earlier, traditional tropes against the Jews. These negative images have appeared in all different formats on the streets, in the public square, and even certainly on our social platforms. As we know, the traditional modality of measuring anti-Semitism is framed by the Anti-Defamation League using a traditional set of 11 hate measures to determine the degree and scope of harassment, victimization, boycotts, and various assaults. What we have seen from all of their studies suggests a continuous increase from 2015 forward, noting that the 2019 study represented a 12% increase. We should note that more than 1/2 of America's Jews today indicate that they have either experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism in their own lives. 2/3 feel less safe, and that is based on a number of surveys. And 1 in 4 who are affiliated with Jewish institutions have noted that those institutions have in some form or another been vandalized. Half of those who normally would wear religious garb in public are declining to do so in this new modality of behavior. Next slide. What we fully understand is that this violence and this level of hate has accelerated over the past 6 months. What we also believe, as we move closer to the 2020 elections, we will increasingly see other expressions, both from the right and the left, to raise questions about the status, role, and position of Jews in America. Indeed, what we believe and will continue to affirm is that the breeding ground for much of this is the social media, the platforms that are available for hate expression. And much of this war is now being labeled around the questions associated with the whiteness of American Jews. The right suggesting that the Jews are seeking to replace them, whereas the left speaks to the notion that Jews are no longer the victims or persecuted in society, but have become now the perpetrators of power. What can be done? In the course of our conversation this afternoon, we will be talking about various expressions and responses, but here are 3. Certainly the passage in the Congress this year of the Never Again Education Act, which funds basic Holocaust education, is an important step, but it is only one step. Other legislation and certainly efforts at greater federal and state monitoring of hate and hate crimes is essential. And the work of the American Jewish Committee and others in coalition building is a core ingredient as we move forward. At this point, I want to bring us back in conversation with Saba and to open this discussion in a more contemporary form. Saba, I think you in your work and certainly in your writings deal with a lot of the questions associated with contemporary aspects of anti-Semitism, and I would welcome some of your reflections about what you are observing and reporting on.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to Wilshire Boulevard and the Casden for having me. I think what we're seeing right now is this is a really interesting time because what we're finding is that anti-Semitism is where the right, the far right, and the far left really converge together, kind of that horseshoe theory where they don't agree on anything else, but they do agree on anti-Semitism. And I think what we're seeing with the far right is it's so obvious. So it's not hard to define, it's not hard to see, it's right there in our face. What makes it more difficult with the far left is that it's more insidious and it's done within the conversations mostly surrounding Israel and anti-Zionism. And a lot of other so-called Jewish groups participate in it. And what you find is that Israel has now become the collective Jew. So Jewish power is now Zionist power. Israel controls the media. Israel controls Congress. Israel controls America. Israel controls the banks. Jews were the devil, and now Israel is the new Nazi. And so I think what we find right now, especially on college campuses and just within the space within the left, the far left, is that that cloak of anti-Zionism is basically it's dressed up in a, sorry, anti-Semitism is dressed up in an anti-Zionist conversation, where with the far right, it's very obvious, but the far left, you're seeing it more in an insidious manner.
I wonder if we could spend a few minutes talking about some of the thematic positions here. I referenced in my slide presentation the replacement theory, but there's cancel culture, there's
Right.
intersectionality. I wonder if you would like to offer some thoughts about these and maybe other themes that are very much evident.
Absolutely. So intersectionality is a word, just to define it in case people aren't familiar with it. It was coined by a law professor, Kimberly Crenshaw, who talks about the fact where intersectionality is where marginalized groups work together. And I'm sorry, I'm simplifying it, but marginalized groups work together in order to fight against their subjugation. So this is where the African-American and the LGBTQ and the Latinx community will come together and fight because we're stronger fighting together. an allyship, which is absolutely correct. The problem with intersectionality, I think today, is that intersectionality has these very simplified ideas of white oppressor, brown, black, indigenous, and there isn't this, gray area between that. It also doesn't look at history. It doesn't look at understanding people's communities and where they come from. So intersectionality will tell you that Jews are white, and on some level Jews could be white. I mean, absolutely, they're not dealing with what brown and black people are dealing with if they're walking into a store or something like that. But that Jews are oppressors, Jews are colonizers, Jews have no place to be in the Middle East, Jews have no place to be in progressive movements. And my question is, well, what does that do with me? I'm a brown Jew, I'm from Iran. What does that have to, where do the almost 1 million Jews who got kicked out of the Middle East and North Africa, how are they seen as white? How are you looking at Israel as this white colonizer state when almost 60% of Israeli population is Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East? What are we thinking when we're looking at Black Jews, Ethiopian Jews? And so cancel culture, also this idea that as soon as you speak out against something, everyone's going to cancel you. You have no right to say anything. And you could be popular one day, the next day you lose your job, etc. And the problem with cancel culture is, well, what happens to people to be able to learn, to explain, to be able to say, okay, I understand what just happened, and now I'm trying to make it better. I think Nick Cannon is a great example of that. He made some anti-Semitic comments, and he really studied and he really learned, and people want to cancel him within the far left because they think he bowed down to the Jew. And instead, it's not that. He really took the time to understand what he was saying and why it was anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I think you raised the Nick Cannon case, and I would think we should talk for a few moments certainly about Black Lives Matter and the whole question of really the Black-Jewish connection and how some of that has been eroded and been distorted as we look at issues associated with the more recent events involving Black Lives Matter. One clear note that we must point out: the movement for Black Lives Matter has taken positions hostile to Israel and has certainly demonstrated a more aggressive anti-Jewish frame to its policies and positions. Often that is confused with the larger and less organized, well-organized Black Lives movement, or the whole basis for what has occurred in June and July of this year on our streets, where this is really a bottom-up sort of built from within the society expression, as 25 million Americans of all different persuasions took to the streets over these past 8 to 12 weeks. So you may want to add some thoughts that you have about the whole question of where Blacks and Jews are in this issue.
As we know, the African American and Jewish community worked together during the civil rights era. And I think for the most part, of course, it's not like there's a census that was taken to see, but for the most part, the Jewish community is right there with the African American community. And I know that they want to help, they want to be a part of this movement to end racism, to end systematic racism, to in any way that the African American community needs the Jewish community to be there to help, to assist. And it breaks my heart because we're being told by a lot of people that we can't be a part of this unless we step away, or at least give away our ideology of supporting the right of Israel to exist. It's not that they are anti-Semitic, because if you are a Jew who disavows the Zionist ideology, if you're a Jew that disavows Israel having the right to exist, they have no problem with you being a part of the organization. But if you are a Zionist, then you're not allowed to be there. And I think the problem with that is that there's a really delusional understanding of what Zionism means, because there's numerous understandings of what Zionism means, and people don't take the time to understand it, to really understand the history of Israel and Palestine, to understand the two-state solution. They just understand this very simplified version of Israel, Palestine, colonizer, indigenous. And again, this intersectionality aspect of it brings it together. And so then we are being told that we can't be a part of a movement that we want to be a part of, that also is, towards us too, because we know that if one group is being subjugated, we will also be subjugated. And it's also a part of our Jewish identity of tikkun olam to be able to work with and build allies with other communities. But that being said, and as you correctly said, Stephen, it's not the African-American community as a whole. It's certain people and certain leaders. And there's other organizations that you could work with that are amazing that don't get into this issue of intersectionality. We work very closely at AJC with the Urban League. We work closely with the NAACP. So there's other organizations. If you feel like you're not sure, first of all, do your homework. And this is what I always tell people. Don't do a Google search, but really do a deep dive, read articles, go online to see what these people are specifically saying. But it doesn't mean that if one person is, pro BDS and telling you as a Jew who believes in Israel's right to exist, you don't have a right to be there, then you can't be a part of it, because there's other organizations and other people who do. And I think it's really important that we step up as the Jewish community in order to really address this issue.
I think that we want to remind our audience that we will be welcoming their questions as we move forward. But before we take those questions, I think it's important that we talk about conspiracy theory.
Right.
The recent forms of that, of course, involve this terrible ideological idea of the QAnon theoretical model associating pedophiles and banking and conspiracy and state dominance, all tied, unfortunately and tragically, to Jewish connections and to Jewish power and to Jewish greed. That's but one of multiple sort of conspiracy notions that we are seeing. Dealing with conspiracy is a feat or concern unto itself, because it has been so rampant, not only in our times, but as we know from Jewish history, it is a pattern that we have been able to sadly catalog. I wonder if you had any further thoughts on that.
It's fascinating how in 1903, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion came out, and how it has permeated throughout the world in ways that people who don't even know what that book is are still using that ideology, whether it's, again, as you said, coming from the far right or coming from the far left, where Jews are the slave owners, Jews are not real Israelites or Semites, or, none of this even historically is accurate. And all of this comes from, again, just miseducation. I think some people know when they're saying it, and they, when you're saying Jews are satanic or Jews are responsible for the slave trade or for pedophilia or the banking, some people know that what they're saying is specifically aiming at Jews and anti-Semitism. And I think other people really don't understand how, saying Jews have power or Jews have all the power and all the money, how that is seen as being anti-Semitic, because they're not familiar with the history of Jewish anti-Semitism. I know that I had a couple of African-American students who said to me last summer at Oxford, we don't understand why when Ilhan Omar said it's all about the Benjamins, why that was an insult, because that seems like that's a good thing. It's Jews have money. Why is that negative? And then I had to explain to them the history of that. And once these students understood, then they understood. And, they began to understand. It's the same reason why I tell white students when they're like, we don't understand why blackface is negative. And then you explain to them, and then they understand, and hopefully will never, utilize that in a Halloween costume or anything like that. So I think a lot of it is miseducation, but there's definitely people who are out there, leaders who are appropriating it because they know exactly what they are doing. And it's a way to permeate anti-Semitism.
I think that as we move to take our first set of questions, we would remind the audience of sort of 4 or 5 principles. We are seeing, as Saba has beautifully articulated, anti-Semitism from the left and the right. We're seeing a use of terminology and conspiracy thought that describes and shapes anti-Semitism using some of the oldest canards or views about Jews, but that also take on these modern terminologies, intersectionality, cancel culture, and replacement theory. Third, we understand that the platform of the web has become the social media tool of so much of this form of hate expression and behavior. and that finally that we see a lot of this as a result of the kinds of economic, health, and political crises that we are suffering and existing in our society this summer. So all of this has brought this to a head, and I'm certain that our audience will want to delve with us in a more deeper fashion with some of these questions. Steve Ross, we invite you to introduce the questions. I guess Steve has disappeared.
No.
There he is. We cannot hear you, Steve.
Now can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So we have a few questions. And the first one, several of the people would like you both to comment on the sign that appeared on the 405 yesterday. In case those of you have not seen this, on the 405, as you're driving south right by Manchester, on one of the overpasses, somebody hung out a sheet, you know, like a bed sheet, and wrote on it, the Jews, what is it? The Jews want, oh, I got it here. Let me give you exactly what it says. The Jews want a race war, and next to it, it said Goyim TV. So people want you both comment on it and asked, is there any legal recourse to getting that down other than somebody just taking it down themselves, and to identify the perpetrators?
Stephen, I'll let you answer this.
Okay, well, I am not certain of the legal issues here, but my assumption is that these are signages that are inappropriately placed without permit and therefore would by law be removed. Secondly, since the signage is not identified other than by, as Steve Ross points out, Goyim TV, which is an unclear reference point, it is also probably likely that this is a, as much of anti-Semitism as being expressed today, is probably the action of an individual player, an individual actor, rather than necessarily a group that is sponsoring this particular expression or action. And that, by the way, is another phenomenon that we are seeing. We saw this sadly in Pittsburgh, and we saw it again in Poway, and we will continue to likely see different versions of it as single actors use either the public square, as in the case of this signage, or in other ways to articulate their hate messaging. It is also another reality that the national Jewish agencies are now reporting on a daily basis that we are seeing worldwide incidents of anti-Semitism occurring in a consistent and unfortunately a regularized form, which means that the incidents have jumped radically over the past year. And certainly in the 6-month period in which we have experienced the pandemic, we are very much conscious of different forms of those expressions.
Thank you. I mean, Stephen spoke so beautifully. There's nothing I could really add except to say that how much more do we need to prove to people that anti-Semitism exists, that we too need protection, that we too are dealing with this. I mean, we've already had violence on the left and on the right, whether it was in Pittsburgh, in San Diego, in New York. But the idea that Jews are constantly being gaslit when we are saying there's anti-Semitism out there and people are telling us, no, it's not that bad. You're not dealing with it. You're not, it's, you know, you're white. You get away with everything. Don't worry. You know, you're the man. You control everything. How much more do we need proof and evidence that anti-Semitism is out there, whether it is one lone wolf person doing it? But it's not a big deal that this is on the 405 freeway for everyone to see on their way to LAX or anywhere that they're going.
Another question that several people are asking in different forms, but it's the same basic question, is what do we do? How do we address those people, whether on the left or the right or in the center, who say one of the following: I am not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist, or I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm just anti-Israeli apartheid, or some variation on that. How do we address those people who take that point of view?
Saba, would you like to begin?
I'll take an aim at this, and I would like to also invite Stephen Ross, because you deal with this a lot too. So please, also share. But I think what people do not understand is that when you could criticizing Israel is okay. Jews do it all the time. Israelis do it all the time. Israel is a country. It's not a cause per se. You could criticize Israel. It has a history that is far from perfect, like any other country is. So in my idea, and according to the International Holocaust, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, criticizing Israel is okay. Denying Israel's right to exist, demonizing Israel, delegitimizing Israel, applying double standards to Israel, that is when that is anti-Semitic. A professor not supporting BDS and saying, I'm not going to bring an Israeli professor to this university because they are from Israel. It doesn't matter what their politics are. But yet they will bring a professor from Syria, they will bring a professor from the Gulf, countries that are far from perfect, that have human rights violations. And that is when that is, you could say, well, that's anti-Semitism. Why are you just singling out Israel? People don't understand what Zionism means. And there's, of course, different forms of Zionism. But the idea that Jews do not have a right to live in a country that they've lived in for 3,000 years, that is anti-Semitic. And I have no problem telling people that. And unfortunately, students deal with this all the time. People deal with this all the time. And then again, we are gaslit and said, no, Jews throw out anti-Semitism all the time when you criticize Israel. You could criticize Bibi, the far left, the far right, whatever you want to criticize about Israel, hummus, and say it's not Israeli, whatever you want to say. But to deny Israel's right to exist as the Jewish homeland, that is anti-Semitic. And people need to understand that.
I think what we are seeing on the university scene in particular is very much bringing this to the head, to the point. The actions actually within our own community at both UCLA and USC, where we've seen cancel culture, where we've seen attacks on students who have been pro-Israel in their positions, has been most unfortunate. And what concerns me is the need for institutions, academic and political institutions, to certainly defend, protect, and articulate the case for the rights of students, of faculty, and others to speak without the fear of being condemned or being charged with being Zionist or someone who professes support for the Jewish state. I know Steve Ross has lived with this issue both in his writings and now more directly in his own university setting.
Yes, well, I'm getting it from both sides. At one point, we have people both on the left and the right. And my response in general, and I've been asked to sign a petition, actually help write one and sign it, declaring that I'm a Zionist and that we should have the right to say that. And my response to that is, that's the wrong way to go about it, I think. That let's talk, in other words, when somebody starts saying Zionist, anti-Zionist, my response is, let's talk specific issues. Those have become labels that put people in corners and stop conversations rather than begin conversations. So what I've tried to do with people I talk to is say, well, let's unpack, what do you mean? First, does Israel have a right to exist? Yes or no? For me, absolutely, 100%. But there is a thorny question. Does Israel have a right to exist where it is? And what responsibility does it have to the people that have lost land one way or another, whether seized, they abandon it? We know that there's a question of land. So, and also we clearly want to separate Israel from the Israeli government. In the same way, we would hope people would separate the American people and the American nation from our current White House or from any White House. that the American people in the White House are not necessarily the same, but there certainly is a relationship between the two. And I think if you're going to open up a dialogue, we ran something a year ago in the spring of 2019 at Annenberg, a day-long session called Can We Talk About It? Opening the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue. And I was glad that it took place, but saddened by the following, which is we had only 2 Palestinian speakers. Everyone else we had asked refused to be on the panel, as did a number of Jewish speakers. And at the end of the day, when we did a wrap up, my comment was that I was glad we were talking, but one of the things that truly bothered me was every Jewish member on that panel did a mea culpa about what has Israel done wrong, and as a Jew, what responsibility do I bear? Not a single Palestinian speaker was willing to criticize the Palestinian leadership or Palestinian corruption. And I think a dialogue has to happen. If we're going to talk about Israel, we have to have a dialogue on both sides and an honest dialogue. And I would say the same thing, just briefly, and then I'll move to another question, with what's going on now, particularly you have Black Lives Matter and others that in many ways are refusing. They are calling for racial justice while some of the leadership refuses to condemn Louis Farrakhan. And I would simply pose to people who refuse to condemn Louis Farrakhan, how would they feel if any other group, Jews, Catholics, Protestants, whatever you want, refused to condemn David Duke? It seems to me just the flip side of that argument. But to move on to another question, which several people have now raised, can the two of you comment on the new ethnic studies requirement that was just signed by our governor that mentions the Palestinian experience, but not the Jewish experience? And our audience today, several of them asked, is there anything we can do now that the governor has signed this into law?
Saba, would you like to begin?
Sure. AJC, American Jewish Committee, has our LA office, our San Francisco office has been working nonstop on this. And this, Governor Newsom passed this without really, very quietly and very quickly. His understanding of ethnic studies is a very traditional understanding of ethnic studies. The people who are fighting it want a very traditional version of it. Well, there's 2 different ethnic studies. There's the high school, and then there's the Cal State ethnic studies. So that's the Cal State ethnic studies has been passed with a very traditional understanding of what ethnic studies is and the groups that are going to be studied. My issue with that is that a lot of the teachers who teach, a lot of the professors who teach ethnic studies teach it from a very pro-BDS perspective and bring in intersectionality when it has nothing to do, when Jews in Israel have nothing to do with Native Americans or African Americans, et cetera. And people wanted Jewish studies to be a part of the ethnic studies, and that is not the situation. Now, the California ethnic studies for high school students, that is still being something that is in discussion. And I just wrote an op-ed in the Jewish Journal discussing the fact that ethnic studies, we have fought for that ethnic studies because the first draft was so pro-BDS and anti-Israel and didn't even bring up anti-Semitism, when you literally just had what happened in Pittsburgh, what happened in San Diego. Also, by the way, they left out other groups too. So it was just very narrow focus on who they were focusing on. And so they came up with another draft. They also included the Arab American experience. And the reason why I wrote an op-ed was because the Middle Eastern experience that they included was only Muslim. I have no problem. And I encourage Muslim studies, Islamic studies, et cetera. But to talk about the Middle East to California students, most of whom are also from the Middle East, as if there was only one religion that exists in the Middle East, and you're leaving out Zoroastrians, Jews, Christians, Baha'is, that was my issue with the second draft of it, was that it was just too myopic and it was ahistorical. By the way, every class I have ever taken as an undergraduate on the Middle East only focused on, as an undergraduate and graduate student, on the Muslim experience. And every class I took, we're just as guilty in the Jewish community, and the Jewish community only focused on the Ashkenazi experience. So Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews are constantly being left out, whether it is in Middle Eastern studies, in Jewish studies, but this draft specifically completely leaves out any religious minority out of the Middle East. So if a student had no idea and they were studying the Middle East for the first time, they would only think that Muslims exist in the Middle East. And on top of that, you have California has the largest Middle Eastern community, the largest coming from Zoroastrian, Baha'i, just LA in general, Jewish, Christian. These students are not going to be seeing themselves represented in a history of the Middle East.
One of the commentaries to all of this is the demographic changes taking place in this country and in California in particular, and the serious need on the part of the Jewish community and others to confront the reality of these changing demographics, and how we teach about one another is going to be a critical piece, not only to this state's moving forward in terms of its educational philosophy and policy, but also in understanding the changing composition of really how America will look as we head into the middle decades of the 21st century.
And, sorry, Steve, did I interrupt you?
No, not at all.
Can I just add to the community that's watching this? There are a lot of amazing Jewish organizations who are fighting the fight on your behalf. I work at one. There's a lot of them, AJC, ADL, Jimena. We know everyone's in a rough space right now, but if you want people out there in representation and people fighting the fight, then we need to support these organizations, because that is the only way we're getting the voices heard. And our organizations are really good with allyship, but there's a lot of amazing Jewish organizations out there who are, working on behalf of the Jewish community. And, we're nonprofits. So it's, if you want your voice to be heard, join these organizations, help fund them. And that is a really great way to ensure that, just like we did with the first draft of the ethnic studies, that was very pro-BDS, it doesn't pass.
I have another question here that's actually, I think, a really interesting one, which is, we have now spent the last 45 minutes in a very rational discussion about these topics, but how do you approach groups of people that don't want to deal with rational responses to their hate?
Well, Steve, that's a fascinating observation, but unfortunately a realistic one. I think we're living in a moment in time where many folks have simply dropped the art of reason and the act of responsible journalism and responsible discourse. And part of that is framed by the reality that we are living in a time in which government as well as media have created these intensive, heightened expressions of language that does not permit for reasoned conversation. When either government or the media create these terminologies and frame conversations in ways that discount Muslims, discount Jews, discount African Americans and others, we are seeing the certainly the fiber and reality of what that means on the street. The vast majority of Americans still have very positive attitudes toward minorities, in particular American Jews. What has happened is that the voices of hate have taken the center stage. They have dominated the front by the fact that the voices of moderation have simply left the platform to them. So what this requires is really the good people, people who are responsible both in journalism, in politics, and in discourse to push back against such messaging. As long as those messages are out there, we will continue to sadly see accidents and incidents of hate and violence directed against all types of people.
Well, that's a nice lead into another question that kind of anticipates our next meeting with Stephen and Dan Schnur. The question was, do you anticipate a tamping down of anti-Semitism with a Biden presidency?
It's difficult, of course, to know whether we will see continued growth of anti-Semitic actions and behaviors. What we do know is that the likelihood is that a Biden administration will itself articulate a message that pushes back against anti-Semitism and racial hatred. That is pretty evident in both the policies already articulated by the Democratic Party and its candidate. We would hope that we would see similar responses on the Republican side, because this is an essential issue for the preservation of democracy. This is not simply about hate in America. This is about the quality of the democracy that we claim to represent.
You know, Biden brought up anti-Semitism in his speech, and he closed with anti-Semitism in Charlottesville and the comments that the president said regarding the neo-Nazis who marched. And so I do think that Biden will not stoke hatred. I don't think he will, you know, I'm trying to be nonpartisan here, but I'm hoping that it will be better.
Well, I'll add my 2 cents here. I'm working on a new book now with a working title called American Hate, Spying on Nazis, Klansmen, and White Supremacists in Post-World War II in America. And I can tell you, based on history, a Biden administration will tamp down overt acts of anti-Semitism, but all the groups that are promoting it right now, they're not going away. They haven't gone away since they haven't gone away since the late 1930s. And the book I'm writing now is showing a continuum of hate from 1945 to the early 70s, that the same leaders, starting in 1946 in Atlanta with a group called the Colombians, and the Colombians, if you could imagine the Nazi Party and the Ku Klux Klan having a baby, that's who it would be. The Colombians jettisoned the Klan because they called them too conservative, not, ruthless enough. And while Charlottesville, they were chanting, "The Jews will not replace us," the Colombians, the Klans, the Stoner Anti-Jewish Party, the National Renaissance Party, the American Nazi Party, the National States' Right Party, these are just a few of them, all were openly calling for death to Jews. So in some sense, anti-Semitism has tampered itself down a little bit, but these hate groups are always there. And what I would say is, when you have somebody in the White House who says, and I don't care if it would have been a Democrat, Republican, after Charlottesville, that they're good people on both sides, it gives hate groups permission to come out from under the rocks and consider themselves good Americans. And what I have found in both my Hitler in LA book and now in this book, where it's about the American Jewish Committee, the Anti-Defamation League, and the Non-Sectarian League, sending in spies into the South and throughout the Northeast and Midwest to try to protect Jews and Blacks. And the story is a truly only in America story, where you have American groups sending in white Protestants into the Deep South to protect Blacks against any harm. This is a story that will continue to go on, whether it's Biden or somebody else. And the only thing I can say is the lesson from the past is vigilance.
What we are seeing from the Southern Poverty Law Center is an interesting study that in 2008, through the 8 years of the Obama administration, more than 1,000 new groups of hate-related organizations, militias, and various white supremacist groups emerged. And what we have seen from 2016 to today on the far left have been also a sort of evolution or growth of expressions of hate and pushback against the white nationalist movements. So we have seen a huge amount of institutional growth of hate in America over these past 12 years from both the far left and the far right.
Right.
And I would say we just got a question that properly called me out, saying, don't you believe that the Democratic Party does not promote anti-Jewish behavior, as it did not condemn the Squad's anti-Jewish remarks? And I think that's true. That it isn't to say one party is the pure party and the other is the impure party. There is hate and prejudice in all parties. And to me, the answer is education. You've got, in the same way you tried to educate some of the Squad members. Now, whether somebody wants to be educated is a different story. But I think for the three of us on the screen now, we all believe in education. We all believe in rationality, because if you give that up, where do you go?
It's the only thing you could do is education. Education, and unfortunately, a lot of groups believe in anti-normalization, which means that they won't talk to you if you're Jewish, they won't talk to you if you're a Zionist. And where do you go from there if you can't even sit down and have a conversation and try to see each other's narratives and try to build allyship?
That's why we call that day-long conference, Can We Talk About It?
Right.
Can we sit down?
In 1990s, the American Jewish Community made a serious mistake. It began to defund much of its work in community relations inside the United States. That did not mean that it did not continue to be advocates for Israel. It did not deal or did not stop its important work in many other arenas, but it defunded much of the core work of intergroup relations, interreligious affairs, and intercultural connections. And we are paying a price today for the downsizing and the deep cuts that were made by JCRCs, Jewish Community Relations Committees, by some of our national agencies, and even by the government of Israel in terms of this important work, which is now so essential to how we push back against hate.
We got another question here, which is to talk about this. How should our community, how should the Jewish community as a whole, I don't even know we can say that. I'm going to just read the question. How should our community approach Jewish groups that support BDS?
Saba, do you want to take the first crack?
I mean, that's a great question. I don't know. It's so difficult. I think you've already, in a sense, kind of lost those young adults or even older adults, who are part of If Not Now, Jewish Voices for Peace. I think what we need to do is, our Jewish education tends to be very glossed over and tends to be a biased understanding of what's going on in the Middle East. And then what happens is a lot of students then join, go to college, and then they hear a different perspective. And, it's like that's a whole Seth Rogen issue that came up where he said, I didn't know this and I didn't know that. I think what we need to do is we need to teach honestly about Israel. We need to teach about what happened, both the Israeli narrative and also the Palestinian narrative. And I think we also need to teach young adults how to protect and defend Israel. Why BDS? I mean, people think, and I have to say, my students who are pro BDS, they're doing it, they don't even understand what it means, but they don't understand that the leader who started BDS, Omar Barghouti, literally believes in the annihilation of a Jewish state. This isn't a passive understanding of how to deal with Israel. This is to annihilate Israel, but people don't know that. People are not educated about that. When they refer to Israel as an apartheid state, well, how insulting is that to South Africans who actually legitimately dealt with an apartheid? And I'm not saying there's not racism in Israel. It's, again, as I will say, far from perfect. There's a lot of issues they need to deal with, et cetera, as a country, but we need to educate young adults, because if you've joined Jewish Voices for Peace, or If Not Now, then I think it's a lost cause. I don't think it is possible. And I think those groups are very responsible for permeating so much anti-Semitism.
I think we have a 5-part agenda. The first part is, as we've all agreed, is education. This is public schools as well as parochial schools, certainly Jewish educational initiatives about Israel, about hate and anti-Semitism, about cultural diversity, understanding America as a changing society. The second is about the art of listening. We need to be able to listen to those who disagree with us, those that are rationally in disagreement, and to build a stronger way by which we deal with our opponents and those who share different political values and views from us, that come to the table accepting the existence of the state of Israel and disagreeing with us on particular policies or practices. The third is that we need to do what was done to and for many members of the Congress and the Senate and our state legislatures. Over the years, the National Jewish Agencies and the JCRCs created missions to Israel for key leaders. And we need to reassert the value of leadership going to Israel. Kamala Harris's views on Israel were born by her first trip sponsored by the JCRC of San Francisco, where she learned the basics of why a Jewish state and its importance to the United States. We need to create new and young leaders who are out in the public square, doing the kind of work on behalf of AJC, ADL, and others that reflect the importance of community relations work. And frankly, I think this community needs a JCRC, a Jewish Community Relations Committee. We had one of the oldest in this country, 1933 till 2007. And in this downsizing modality, we lost that important vehicle that helped to create alliances, relationships, and coalitions for our community.
On maybe the last question, and this will be the last one for the afternoon, again, we are dealing with a rational set of approaches, which is all we can deal with. But somebody points out, wasn't World War II era Germany the best, quote, educated, unquote, nation in the world? What's needed is values education, and with the decreasing influence of religion in society, where will that education come from?
Nazi Germany was educated, but they weren't educated about anti-Semitism. They weren't, I mean, if anything, they were educated in a Christian version of anti-Semitism, and they were supported with, you know, they were being educated with Christianity's understanding of Jews and the, you know, that version of anti-Semitism. So it depends on what education, and this is why the ethnic studies models are so important, is these students will get educated, but who's doing the educating and what is their political bias? And how much do those professors or high school students even know about anti-Semitism, BDS, the narrative of Israel-Palestine, to be then able to teach it to other students? So it's going back to exactly what Stephen said, is we need organizations to teach and people to go out there and teach. We need young adults. You know, for example, AJC has Leaders for Tomorrow program where we teach Jewish education, Israel education. We talk about anti-Semitism. So when high school students go to college, they will be then able to be a part of coalitions, allyships, and they will also be able to refute a narrative that is being placed out there of Jews and anti-Semitism. So education is important, but it is the type of education that is important. This goes back to what Stephen said about needing people out there in the community. My job specifically at AJC, one of my many portfolios, is going out and doing interfaith, intercommunity relations. Because we don't have that, and we need people to understand this is the perspective of the Jewish community, and you cannot speak on our behalf and tell us what is and is not anti-Semitic. Only we could tell you what is and is not anti-Semitic.
David Nirenberg, the dean of the University of Chicago Divinity School, has written this extraordinary document dealing with the sort of roots of anti-Semitism, and his argument is that this is a Western cultural theme, that Germany and France and all of Europe were deeply embedded with these ideas over the centuries, and that Nazism, as one expression of this, referenced this whole notion of beliefs about Jews and attitudes about what Judaism represented. This is a long and difficult fight in terms of changing culture. culture which is found in Islam and culture that is found in Western society and civilization about the other, and how we change and modify and educate folks to a different understanding of cultural and religious diversity. Indeed, religion in the world is in decline, but religion is an idea that is continuously studied and referenced. And in that context, a religion is an important player in correcting past injustices. To the credit of the Roman Catholic Church, who dealt with and is continuing to deal with its own history of anti-Semitism, this is the model that we need to see being portrayed by governments in Europe and across the world. And this is going to be the agenda for the state of Israel as it begins to build its relationships in Africa and in North Africa, as it moves to build new diplomatic ties, because it's all a part of re-educating a world that has viewed Jews and Judaism in very marginalized terms.
Well, it is now almost 5 after 5. I promised we would have a 1 hour Zoom, not an hour and a half. So I want to thank Stephen and Saba. I want to thank Susan Nannis and Wilshire Boulevard Temple. And I want to thank Don Levy, who has run our webinar today. And especially I want to thank everyone who has come and watched us this afternoon. And I invite you all to join us again on Sunday, October 18th at 4 o'clock, when Stephen Windmueller will be in conversation with Dan Schnurr to talk about the 2020 elections, Jewish trends. Thank you all for coming, and I hope we'll see you again in another several weeks. Have a good Sunday afternoon.